Obedience to the Spirit is the flesh's greatest threat. Obedience to the Spirit is not a gentle suggestion, it is a direct threat to the rule of the flesh. From the moment a person begins to listen inwardly rather than react instinctively, an invisible conflict ignites. Scripture never presents spiritual life as neutral ground. There is always a ruler. Either the Spirit governs the inner life, or the flesh quietly takes control through habits, impulses, fears, and unexamined desires. The tragedy is that many people believe they are spiritually alive while their daily decisions are still dictated by the flesh. Obedience exposes that illusion. It pulls the hidden ruler into the light. The flesh fears obedience because obedience removes its negotiating power. As long as faith remains abstract, emotional, or theoretical, the flesh feels safe. It can coexist with religious language, moral identity, and even public devotion. But when obedience becomes practical, when choices are surrendered, appetites restrained, and reactions crucified, the flesh begins to lose territory. That loss feels like death because in truth it is. The flesh does not reform. It resists, it does not cooperate, it counterattacks. This is why spiritual growth often intensifies inner conflict rather than calming it at first. This message is not about external enemies, social pressures, or cultural darkness. It is about the most persistent opposition to spiritual life, the unredeemed self. Obedience to the Spirit is the greatest threat the flesh will ever face because it dismantles control at the root. Not through force, but through surrender. Not through striving, but through submission. And submission to the flesh is intolerable. What follows is not motivational language or shallow encouragement. It is a sober examination of the inner war that defines genuine spiritual transformation. This journey begins with understanding why obedience exposes the flesh and why resistance intensifies precisely when obedience becomes real. Why the flesh fears obedience more than failure. The flesh is not most threatened by failure, weakness, or even sin. It thrives in those environments. Failure keeps a person self-focused. Weakness invites self-pity. Repeated sin creates cycles of guilt that feel spiritual but never produce surrender. In all of these states, the flesh remains central. It may feel broken, ashamed, or desperate, but it is still in control. Obedience, however, shifts authority away from the self entirely. That is why the flesh fears it more than anything else. Obedience requires listening before acting. The flesh is impulsive by nature. It reacts, justifies, and rationalizes. It prefers speed because speed prevents discernment. When obedience slows a person down, when it demands waiting, prayer, and restraint, the flesh experiences exposure. Its instincts are questioned. Its urgency is challenged. This delay feels like suffocation because the flesh survives on momentum. Obedience interrupts that momentum and introduces accountability to something beyond desire. The flesh also fears obedience because obedience reveals motive. Many actions can look righteous on the surface while being driven by pride, fear, or self-protection underneath. Obedience forces a deeper question. Not is this allowed? But is this aligned? Alignment cannot be faked for long. Over time, obedience exposes the gap between what a person claims to believe and what actually governs their decisions. That exposure is uncomfortable because it removes the ability to hide behind appearances. Another reason the flesh fears obedience is that obedience dismantles conditional faith. The flesh prefers a transactional relationship with spirituality. Obedience when convenient, surrender when beneficial, sacrifice when rewarded. But true obedience is not negotiated. It is offered without guarantees. When a person obeys the Spirit without knowing the outcome, the flesh loses leverage. It can no longer bargain for safety, recognition, or control. That surrender feels like risk, and the flesh equates risk with danger. Obedience also threatens the flesh because it produces consistency. Emotional spirituality fluctuates. Obedient spirituality stabilizes. The flesh can manipulate moods, circumstances, and crises, but it struggles against steady discipline. When obedience becomes a pattern rather than a reaction, the flesh's influence weakens. Habits begin to form that do not depend on feelings. Decisions become anchored in conviction rather than impulse. Over time, the flesh finds fewer entry points. Perhaps most threatening of all, obedience shifts identity. The flesh wants identity rooted in personality, history, trauma, or achievement. Obedience relocates identity into relationship and calling. A person who obeys the Spirit consistently begins to see themselves not as a bundle of desires to be managed, but as a vessel to be guided. This reframing is devastating to the flesh because it no longer gets to define the self. Authority moves upward, and the flesh becomes subordinate. Resistance often intensifies right before this shift occurs. Many people misinterpret that resistance as failure or spiritual attack from outside sources. In reality, it is often the last stand of the flesh fighting to retain influence. Doubt increases, distractions multiply, old habits resurface with new intensity. This is not coincidence, it is confrontation. Obedience has reached a level where it threatens control, and the flesh responds accordingly. Understanding this dynamic prevents discouragement. When obedience becomes harder, it does not mean the path is wrong. It often means it is working. The flesh does not fight what it already owns. It fights what it is about to lose. Obedience is quiet, but its effects are violent to the flesh. It strips away false autonomy. It challenges cherished habits. It reorders priorities. And most importantly, it transfers authority from desire to discernment. That transfer is irreversible once fully embraced. This is why the flesh resists obedience more fiercely than it resists repentance, remorse, or religious effort. Obedience ends its reign. If this message resonates, and you want to continue exploring what it truly means to walk led by the Spirit rather than ruled by the flesh, subscribe to the channel. These teachings are part of a deeper journey into spiritual clarity, discipline, and transformation. How obedience slowly dismantles the flesh's hidden control. The flesh rarely rules through obvious rebellion. Its most effective power is subtlety. It does not announce itself as opposition to the Spirit. Instead, it disguises itself as reason, self-care, caution, realism, and even wisdom. This is why many people believe they are walking in obedience while their inner life remains largely governed by the flesh. Obedience, when genuine and sustained, does something deeply unsettling to this hidden control. It exposes it layer by layer, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet consistency. The first thing obedience dismantles is the illusion of neutrality. The flesh thrives in gray areas. It prefers situations where decisions can be postponed, convictions softened, and boundaries blurred. Obedience eliminates that comfort. It forces clarity. A person who commits to obeying the Spirit begins to notice how often decisions were previously made by default rather than discernment. Silence becomes uncomfortable, because silence reveals whose voice has been dominant. When obedience becomes the standard, neutrality disappears. Every choice begins to lean either towards surrender or self-rule. This shift is rarely dramatic at first. It begins internally. A subtle resistance arises when familiar patterns are questioned. The flesh reacts not with open defiance, but with internal arguments. It suggests that obedience can wait, that timing matters, that circumstances are not ideal. These thoughts feel reasonable, even responsible, but obedience does not require ideal conditions. It requires willingness. Over time, the person learns to recognize these inner negotiations for what they are, attempts to delay surrender. As obedience continues, the flesh's control over emotional responses weakens. The flesh governs through reaction. It feeds on offense, fear, impatience, and comparison. Obedience introduces restraint, not suppression but submission. Instead of reacting immediately, the obedient person pauses. That pause is devastating to the flesh because reaction is its primary weapon. When reaction is delayed, discernment enters. When discernment enters, impulsive behavior loses momentum. Slowly, the flesh finds fewer emotional levers to pull. Another area obedience dismantles is identity attachment. The flesh builds identity around roles, wounds, achievements, failures, and labels. These identities feel deeply personal, even sacred. Obedience challenges them without directly attacking them. As a person listens more closely to the Spirit, they begin to sense when an identity is being used as an excuse. Phrases like, "This is just who I am," start to lose authority. Obedience asks a different question. Is this who I am called to be? That question destabilizes identities rooted in the past, rather than purpose. The flesh resists this destabilization by invoking fear. It warns that without these identities, the self will dissolve. It suggests that surrender will erase uniqueness, dull personality, or lead to loss. This fear is deceptive. Obedience does not erase the self, it refines it. But refinement feels like loss before it feels like freedom. The flesh interprets refinement as threat because it cannot survive without exaggeration, defensiveness, and self-centered narratives. Obedience also exposes how deeply the flesh relies on control. The flesh does not trust guidance, it trusts management. It wants to anticipate outcomes, calculate risks, and secure advantages. Obedience disrupts this strategy by requiring trust without full visibility. When a person obeys the Spirit without knowing how things will unfold, the flesh experiences anxiety. That anxiety is not a sign of danger. It is a sign that control is slipping. Over time, repeated acts of obedience retrain the nervous system itself. The body learns that surrender does not equal annihilation. Peace begins to replace tension. One of the most significant ways obedience dismantles hidden flesh control is through consistency. The flesh can tolerate occasional obedience. It can survive moments of surrender. What it cannot withstand is daily submission. Daily obedience removes the flesh's ability to predict opportunities, to reassert dominance. When prayer becomes routine rather than reactive, when discipline replaces motivation, when silence is embraced rather than avoided, the flesh's influence erodes steadily. This erosion often feels anticlimactic. There is no dramatic collapse, no sudden victory. Instead, there is a gradual weakening. Old habits lose their grip. Temptations feel less urgent. Emotional triggers no longer dictate behavior with the same force. This subtlety can cause doubt. The flesh exploits this doubt by suggesting that nothing is changing. But the very lack of chaos is evidence of transformation. The flesh thrives on extremes. Obedience creates steadiness. Another hidden mechanism obedience dismantles is comparison. The flesh constantly measures. Progress against others, spirituality against appearance, worth against performance. Obedience redirects attention inward and upward rather than outward. The obedient person becomes less concerned with how they are perceived and more concerned with alignment. This shift starves the flesh of validation. Without constant comparison, pride and insecurity lose their fuel. Obedience also reorders time. The flesh lives in urgency or nostalgia. It rushes or regrets. Obedience anchors a person in the present moment. It emphasizes faithfulness now rather than anxiety about later. This temporal grounding is powerful. When attention is focused on the present act of obedience, the flesh loses its ability to manipulate through imagined futures or remembered failures. Peace emerges not because circumstances improve, but because attention is correctly placed. As obedience deepens, The flesh's last refuge becomes spiritualization. It attempts to co-opt spiritual language to maintain influence. Thoughts like, "This feels spiritual," "This aligns with my peace," or "This resonates with me," can be used to justify avoidance of difficult obedience. The obedient person learns to discern between comfort and conviction. True obedience often feels costly before it feels peaceful. The flesh prefers immediate comfort. The spirit often leads through tension toward transformation. Eventually, obedience reaches a point where the flesh's hidden control is no longer hidden. Patterns become obvious. Triggers are recognized quickly. Self-justifications lose credibility. At this stage, the inner conflict changes. It becomes less confusing and more direct. The person no longer wonders why resistance exists. They understand its source. This clarity is empowering. The flesh cannot manipulate what has been exposed. Importantly, obedience does not annihilate desire, it orders it. The flesh wants to dominate desire, to let it rule unchecked. Obedience brings desire under alignment. This reordering is liberating. Desire becomes purposeful rather than compulsive. Longings become directional rather than chaotic. The flesh experiences this as loss, but the soul experiences it as coherence. It is crucial to understand that obedience does not make life easier in the conventional sense, it makes life clearer. Clarity can be uncomfortable, especially for a flesh accustomed to ambiguity. But clarity also brings peace. Decisions become simpler, even when they are difficult. Inner noise quiets, the constant internal debate diminishes. Energy once spent on justification is redirected toward faithfulness. Over time, the flesh's hidden control gives way to transparent surrender. The person no longer lives in constant self-monitoring or self-defense. There is less need to explain oneself, to prove worth, or to secure outcomes. Trust replaces strategy. This is not passivity. It is alignment. Action flows from obedience rather than anxiety. The dismantling of the flesh is not a single event. It is a process sustained by daily, often unnoticed choices. Choosing restraint over reaction, silence over impulse, faithfulness over visibility. Each choice weakens the flesh's grip and strengthens spiritual authority. The flesh cannot survive in an environment where obedience is normal. If you are walking this path and recognize these inner shifts, this quiet unraveling of old patterns, understand that you are not losing yourself. You are being reordered. And if you want to continue this journey of understanding the deep mechanics of spiritual obedience and inner transformation, subscribe to the channel. These teachings are here to support those who choose surrender over self-rule and clarity over control. The moment obedience becomes a daily death to the flesh. There comes a point in the life of anyone genuinely walking by the Spirit when obedience stops feeling inspirational and starts feeling costly. This is the moment many misunderstand. They assume something has gone wrong because the emotional rewards they once felt have faded. But this moment is not failure. It is transition. It is the point where obedience stops being an occasional act and becomes a daily posture. And daily obedience is nothing less than a daily death to the flesh. The flesh can tolerate isolated sacrifices. It can survive moments of surrender, followed by long periods of self-rule. What it cannot endure is rhythm. When obedience becomes consistent, predictable, and non-negotiable, the flesh begins to experience existential threat. This is why resistance intensifies not at the beginning of spiritual pursuit, but deeper into it. The closer obedience moves toward becoming a way of life, the more aggressively the flesh responds. Daily obedience dismantles the flesh because it removes its ability to reset control. The flesh relies on recovery cycles. It assumes that after restraint there will be indulgence, after discipline there will be relaxation, after sacrifice there will be compensation. Daily obedience breaks this expectation. There is no scheduled return to self-rule. There is no later where the flesh regains dominance. This continuity creates pressure, and under pressure, the true nature of the flesh is revealed. At this stage, the conflict is no longer about obvious temptation. It becomes internal, subtle, and psychological. The flesh begins to weaponize fatigue. It whispers that obedience is unsustainable, that rest requires compromise, that devotion must be balanced with indulgence. These thoughts feel compassionate, even wise, but beneath them is the same agenda, reclaiming authority. The spirit leads toward endurance. The flesh argues for relief. The difference between the two is not always immediately apparent. Daily obedience also exposes the flesh's dependency on emotional motivation. The flesh prefers actions fueled by excitement, urgency, or fear. Obedience fueled by commitment rather than emotion deprives the flesh of leverage. When a person obeys without feeling inspired, the flesh loses influence. It cannot manipulate mood-based devotion. This is why obedience often feels dry during this phase. Dryness is not absence of life. It is absence of emotional reinforcement. The flesh interprets this as loss, but the spirit uses it to deepen faith. As obedience continues, the flesh begins to protest through boredom. Boredom is not neutral, it is a defense mechanism. The flesh thrives on stimulation. It wants novelty, intensity, and variation. Obedience introduces repetition. The same disciplines, the same choices, the same surrender. This repetition feels unbearable to the flesh because it cannot distract itself. In repetition, the flesh is forced to confront its own emptiness. There is no thrill to mask its lack of substance. Another tactic the flesh employs during daily obedience is self-criticism. It begins to highlight imperfections, inconsistencies, and perceived hypocrisy. These accusations can sound spiritual, even humble, but their function is sabotage. By shifting focus to inadequacy, the flesh attempts to discourage perseverance. The obedient person learns a crucial distinction here. Conviction leads to surrender. Accusation leads to withdrawal. The spirit corrects with clarity and direction. The flesh condemns with vagueness and despair. Daily obedience also strips away the flesh's reliance on recognition. Early in spiritual growth, obedience may be affirmed by others or rewarded with visible outcomes. As obedience matures, these reinforcements often disappear. The flesh becomes restless without affirmation. It begins to question the value of unseen faithfulness. But obedience that depends on recognition is not obedience, it is performance. When recognition fades, true obedience is revealed. This phase is where many quietly turn back, not into obvious rebellion, but into selective obedience. They obey where it feels manageable and retreat where it feels costly. This selective obedience creates internal fragmentation. Peace diminishes, clarity fades, the flesh regains partial control. But for those who persist, something remarkable begins to happen beneath the surface. As daily obedience continues, the flesh begins to weaken in ways that are not immediately dramatic, but deeply transformative. Its voice grows quieter, its arguments become repetitive and unconvincing. The urgency it once carried diminishes. This is not because the flesh has been defeated in a single battle, but because it has been starved of reinforcement. Daily obedience deprives it of reaction, indulgence, and justification. Without these, its power erodes. At the same time, the spirit's influence becomes more natural. Discernment sharpens. Decisions require less internal debate. What once felt forced begins to feel aligned. This is not ease in the sense of comfort, but ease in the sense of coherence. The inner life becomes less divided. Actions flow from conviction rather than conflict. The daily death to the flesh produces daily integration of the self. Importantly, this death is not violent, it is quiet. There is no dramatic collapse of desire, no sudden eradication of struggle. Instead, there is a gradual loss of interest in what once dominated attention. Old temptations feel less compelling, old fears lose urgency, old patterns feel foreign. The flesh experiences this as loss of identity. The soul experiences it as relief. Daily obedience also reshapes how suffering is perceived. The flesh interprets discomfort as failure or punishment. Obedience reframes discomfort as refinement. This shift changes everything. Hardship no longer signals abandonment, it signals formation. The obedient person learns to remain steady even when circumstances are unresolved. This steadiness is intolerable to the flesh because it cannot manipulate through crisis when panic is absent. As the flesh weakens, it makes one final, desperate appeal. It promises peace if obedience is relaxed. It suggests that a small compromise will restore balance, reduce tension, and make life more enjoyable. This is one of the most dangerous moments in spiritual formation. The promise is seductive because it contains partial truth. Compromise does reduce tension, but it restores the flesh's control. The peace it offers is temporary and superficial. The clarity gained through obedience cannot coexist with divided allegiance. Those who resist this appeal experience a profound shift. Obedience stops feeling like loss and begins to feel like freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from inner chaos. The constant negotiation ends. The need to justify disappears. Life simplifies even when it remains demanding. The flesh no longer dominates attention because it no longer dictates direction. Daily obedience also deepens humility. Not the performative humility that draws attention, but the quiet humility that comes from recognizing dependence. The obedient person becomes less reactive to criticism and praise alike. Identity is no longer fragile because it is no longer self-generated. This stability is deeply threatening to the flesh, which survives on comparison and self-evaluation. Over time, obedience becomes less about resisting the flesh and more about remaining aligned with the Spirit. The battle does not disappear, but it changes character. It becomes less dramatic, less consuming. The flesh still exists, but it no longer rules. Its presence is acknowledged without being obeyed. This is the fruit of daily death, not annihilation, but subordination. It is important to understand that this stage is not reserved for the spiritually elite. It is the natural outcome of sustained obedience. Anyone who continues to choose surrender over self-rule will encounter this transformation. It cannot be rushed, and it cannot be bypassed. Attempts to skip daily obedience in favor of spiritual experiences only strengthen the flesh's grip. The daily death to the flesh is not glamorous. It will not make you impressive. It will make you grounded. It will not elevate you above others. It will anchor you within yourself. And from that anchoring comes authority. Not authority over others, but authority over one's own life. The flesh fears this authority because it cannot compete with it. If you are in this season, where obedience feels repetitive, costly, and unseen, understand that you are not regressing. You are being established. This is the work that lasts. And if you want to continue walking deeper into this understanding of spiritual obedience, daily surrender, and inner transformation, subscribe to the channel. These teachings are for those who choose faithfulness over comfort and alignment over control. When obedience restructures the inner world and the flesh loses its language. There is a stage in spiritual obedience that is rarely described because it cannot be fully understood from the outside. It is the moment when obedience no longer feels like resistance against the flesh, but a complete restructuring of the inner world. At this stage, the flesh does not merely lose power, it begins to lose its language. The internal dialogue that once dominated the mind, arguments, justifications, emotional narratives, fears, and impulsive desires, slowly loses coherence. The flesh still exists, but it can no longer articulate itself with the same authority. This is one of the most profound and unsettling transformations obedience produces. The flesh survives through narrative. It tells stories to maintain control. Stories about entitlement, self-protection, fairness, exhaustion, unmet needs, and personal limits. These narratives feel personal, even sacred, because they have been rehearsed for years. Obedience interrupts these stories not by arguing with them, but by ignoring them. This is deeply destabilizing to the flesh. When its narratives no longer determine action, it loses its primary mechanism of influence. At this stage, obedience begins to rewire perception itself. The obedient person no longer evaluates life primarily through emotional response or personal preference. Instead, perception becomes oriented around alignment. The central question quietly shifts from "how do I feel about this?" to "what is required of me here?" This shift is devastating to the flesh because it removes emotion from the position of authority. Emotion remains present, but it no longer governs direction. One of the clearest signs that obedience has reached this depth is the collapse of internal debate. Earlier stages of obedience are filled with mental arguments. Every decision feels contested. The flesh presents alternatives, objections, and rationalizations. But as obedience matures, these debates lose intensity, not because choices become easier, but because authority becomes clearer. When authority is clear, debate becomes unnecessary. The flesh can still speak, but it is no longer convincing. This restructuring also affects memory. The flesh weaponizes the past. It replays failures, regrets, wounds, and betrayals to justify present behavior. Obedience gradually loosens the emotional charge of these memories. They are not erased, but they are no longer controlling. The obedient person remembers without reliving. This distinction is crucial. Reliving empowers the flesh. Remembering with clarity empowers discernment. When the past loses its emotional dominance, the flesh loses a major source of leverage. As obedience continues, the flesh attempts to reassert control by intensifying sensations. Desires may surge unexpectedly. Old temptations may return with surprising force. Emotional reactions may feel sharper for a time. This is not regression, it is resistance. The flesh is attempting to provoke reaction, to reignite the old reflexes that once governed behavior. But when obedience has restructured the inner world, these surges no longer produce the same outcomes. Sensation arises, but action does not automatically follow. This separation is transformative. Another profound change occurs in how silence is experienced. Earlier in the journey, silence can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. The flesh fills silence with noise, thoughts, worries, fantasies, and distractions. But as obedience deepens, silence becomes spacious. It is no longer empty. It is ordered. This ordered silence is intolerable to the flesh because it cannot hide within it. Without noise, the flesh has nothing to manipulate. Silence becomes a place of clarity rather than anxiety. Obedience at this level also dismantles the flesh's attachment to urgency. The flesh lives in a constant state of hurry. It demands immediate resolution, quick relief, fast gratification. Obedience introduces patience not as a virtue to be admired, but as a condition of alignment. The obedient person no longer feels compelled to resolve everything immediately. This does not produce passivity, it produces steadiness. Decisions are made deliberately rather than reactively. The flesh experiences this as loss of momentum, and momentum is essential to its survival. One of the most unsettling aspects of this stage is the loss of dramatic emotion. Many people equate spirituality with intensity, strong feelings, powerful experiences, emotional highs and lows. As obedience restructures the inner world, emotional extremes often diminish. Life becomes less dramatic internally. The flesh interprets this as boredom or loss of passion. In reality, it is the emergence of stability. Stability feels foreign to the flesh because it cannot exploit it. But stability is where discernment thrives. This emotional leveling can be deeply confusing. The obedient person may wonder if they have become numb or disconnected. But numbness is absence. Stability is presence without chaos. The difference becomes clear over time. Peace replaces anxiety. Focus replaces distraction. The mind becomes less crowded. The flesh has fewer entry points because it can no longer hijack emotion to drive behavior. Another critical shift occurs in how the self is experienced. Earlier stages of obedience still involve a strong sense of self-monitoring. Am I doing this right? Am I failing? Am I growing? These questions, while sincere, keep attention turned inward. As obedience matures, attention moves outward and upward. The self becomes less central, not erased, but decentered. This decentering is catastrophic for the flesh because it thrives on self-absorption. When the self is no longer the primary reference point, the flesh loses relevance. Obedience also reshapes how relationships are navigated. The flesh seeks validation, control, and protection within relationships. It reacts strongly to perceived threats, rejection, or loss of status. As obedience restructures the inner world, relationships are no longer used to regulate identity. The obedient person becomes less reactive to others' behavior. Boundaries strengthen without hostility. Compassion deepens without self-betrayal. The flesh struggles in this environment because relational drama is one of its favorite tools. At this depth, obedience produces a kind of quiet authority, not dominance, not assertiveness, but presence. The obedient person carries less tension. They do not need to prove themselves. They do not need to win arguments or control outcomes. This presence is deeply unsettling to environments governed by ego and reaction. The flesh, both internally and externally, senses that its usual tactics no longer work. Importantly, this restructuring does not eliminate struggle. Temptation still arises. Fatigue still occurs. Discouragement still visits. But these experiences no longer define identity or direction. They are encountered, not obeyed. The flesh still speaks, but it no longer sets the agenda. This is what it means for the flesh to lose its language. It can express sensation, but it cannot command response. There is also a new relationship with failure at this stage. Failure no longer produces collapse or self-condemnation. It is met with clarity and correction rather than shame. The flesh relies on shame to regain control. When shame loses its power, the flesh loses one of its most effective weapons. Obedience teaches the soul to return to alignment quickly without dramatizing missteps. This resilience is devastating to the flesh's strategy of discouragement. As obedience continues to shape the inner world, life begins to feel simpler. Not easier, but simpler. Complexity, driven by internal conflict, dissolves. Decisions align more naturally with conviction. Energy, once consumed by inner resistance, becomes available for faithfulness. This simplicity is not minimalism. It is coherence. The flesh cannot survive in coherence because it depends on fragmentation. Eventually, the obedient person realizes something quietly profound. They are no longer primarily resisting the flesh. They are living from alignment. Resistance is no longer the focus. Faithfulness is. The flesh still exists, but it has been displaced from the center. This displacement is the greatest threat obedience poses to the flesh. Not punishment, not suppression, replacement. If you find yourself in this quieter, less dramatic, but deeper season, where obedience has reordered your inner world and old impulses no longer speak with authority, do not be alarmed. You are not losing fire, you are gaining clarity. And if you want to continue exploring this depth of spiritual obedience, inner restructuring, and lasting transformation, subscribe to the channel. These teachings are for those who are no longer interested in surface change, but in a life truly governed by the Spirit rather than the flesh. When the flesh is no longer the enemy, but a subdued servant. There is a final stage in the long journey of obedience that very few people reach, not because it is reserved for a select group, but because it requires a level of sustained surrender that most abandon long before arriving. This stage is deeply misunderstood. It is not the elimination of the flesh, nor is it a life without temptation, struggle, or weakness. Instead, it is the moment when the flesh is no longer experienced as an enemy fighting for dominance, but as a subdued servant that has lost the right to command. Obedience does not destroy the flesh, it dethrones it. For most of the journey, the flesh feels like an opponent. There is tension, resistance, argument, and fatigue. The inner life feels like a battlefield. But when obedience has done its long and patient work, something shifts. The struggle changes quality. The flesh no longer feels like a tyrant shouting orders. It becomes more like background noise, present but powerless. This transition is subtle and easy to miss because it does not come with fireworks or dramatic spiritual experiences. It comes with stability. At this stage, obedience is no longer experienced primarily as effort. It has become orientation. Choices flow from alignment rather than force. The will is no longer constantly negotiating with desire. The obedient person does not wake up every day bracing for battle. Instead, there is an underlying direction that remains steady even when emotions fluctuate. The flesh still produces sensations, hunger, fear, attraction, fatigue, but these sensations no longer define identity or direction. This is deeply threatening to the flesh because its power has always depended on urgency. It survives by convincing the person that every impulse requires immediate attention. When urgency disappears, the flesh loses its leverage. Sensation arises, but it is observed rather than obeyed. Desire speaks, but it is not crowned king. The obedient person no longer feels compelled to resolve every internal movement. This patience is not indifference, it is mastery. One of the clearest signs of this stage is the disappearance of constant self-focus. Earlier stages of obedience involve a great deal of introspection. Am I aligned? Am I resisting? Am I growing? While necessary for formation, this self-monitoring can still feed the flesh subtly by keeping attention turned inward. When obedience matures fully, attention naturally shifts outward toward responsibility, service, and presence. The self no longer needs to be managed constantly because it is no longer the center. This decentering is catastrophic for the flesh. The flesh needs attention to survive. It feeds on analysis, comparison, and self-reference. When attention is no longer available, the flesh starves, not violently but gradually. It becomes quiet because it is no longer being fed. This is why truly obedient people often appear calm rather than intense. Intensity is a sign of struggle. Calm is a sign of order. At this depth, obedience also transforms how suffering is experienced. Suffering no longer triggers existential crisis. It is no longer interpreted as evidence of failure, abandonment, or spiritual deficiency. Instead, it is recognized as part of the human condition and engaged with discernment rather than panic. The flesh thrives on interpreting suffering as injustice. Obedience reframes suffering as context rather than verdict. This reframing removes the emotional fuel the flesh needs to rebel. Another major shift occurs in how pleasure is approached. Earlier in the journey, pleasure often feels suspicious. It is associated with temptation and compromise. But when the flesh has been dethroned, pleasure no longer automatically threatens alignment. The flesh is no longer in charge of pleasure. It no longer dictates meaning. Enjoyment can exist without domination. The obedient person can experience good things without clinging, without overindulgence, without fear of losing control. This balanced relationship with pleasure is impossible while the flesh reigns, but natural once it is subdued. Importantly, this stage does not produce arrogance or spiritual pride. In fact, it produces the opposite. There is a deep awareness of dependence. The obedient person knows that this stability is not self-generated. There is no illusion of personal superiority. Humility deepens because the illusion of control has been fully dismantled. The flesh cannot exploit humility here because humility is no longer performative. It is simply accurate. The flesh also loses its ability to manipulate through fear at this stage. Fear still arises, but it no longer dictates behavior. The obedient person understands fear as information, not instruction. This distinction is critical. Fear alerts. It does not command. When fear loses its authority, the flesh loses one of its oldest tools. Decisions are no longer made to avoid discomfort or loss, but to remain aligned. Courage emerges not as boldness, but as steadiness. At this point, obedience produces a kind of inner silence that is difficult to describe, not emptiness, but clarity. The mind is less crowded. Thoughts still arise, but they do not collide constantly. There is space between impulse and action. This space is where freedom lives. The flesh cannot survive in this space because it depends on immediacy. Without immediacy, it cannot dominate. Another defining feature of this stage is the loss of fascination with spiritual struggle itself. Earlier phases are marked by intense focus on temptation, discipline, resistance, and victory. These themes feel important because they dominate experience. But when obedience has fully reordered the inner life, struggle is no longer central. Faithfulness is. The person is no longer obsessed with defeating the flesh. They are simply living aligned. The flesh fades from importance because it no longer rules attention. This does not mean the flesh is gone. It remains part of human existence, but its role has changed. It has become an instrument rather than a master. Bodily needs are acknowledged, emotions are felt, desires are recognized, but none of these are enthroned. They serve rather than rule. This is what it means for the flesh to become a servant. At this stage, obedience also reshapes how time is experienced. The anxious rush of the flesh disappears. There is less urgency to arrive, achieve, or resolve. Life is lived more fully in the present without obsession over outcomes. This presence is not complacency. It is grounded engagement. The obedient person acts decisively when action is required and rests without guilt when rest is appropriate. The flesh cannot exploit rest or action because neither is used to escape alignment. Relationships are also transformed profoundly. The flesh no longer seeks to extract validation, control, or security from others. Love becomes freer because it is no longer transactional. Boundaries are clearer because they are not reactive. Compassion deepens because it is no longer mixed with self-protection. This relational maturity is one of the clearest fruits of obedience, fully integrated into life. Perhaps the most important realization at this stage is this. Obedience was never about suppressing the flesh. It was about establishing order. The flesh only felt like an enemy because it was ruling where it did not belong. Once authority is restored to its proper place, conflict diminishes. The flesh no longer needs to be fought constantly because it is no longer obeyed automatically. This is why obedience to the Spirit is the flesh's greatest threat, not because it causes suffering, but because it causes displacement. The flesh loses its throne. It loses its voice of command. It loses its ability to define reality. And once that authority is lost, it cannot be regained through negotiation or compromise. The order has been restored. Those who reach this stage often do not speak loudly about it. There is no need to convince others. There is no need to prove depth. Life itself reflects alignment. Faithfulness becomes ordinary, and that ordinariness is the greatest victory of all. The flesh thrives on drama. Obedience culminates in quiet authority. If you have followed this journey from resistance to discipline, to daily surrender, to inner restructuring, and now to quiet mastery, understand this clearly. Obedience did not shrink your life, it clarified it. It did not erase your humanity, it redeemed its order. And if you want to continue walking in this depth of understanding, where faith is not emotional noise, but lived alignment, subscribe to the channel. These teachings are for those who no longer want temporary inspiration, but lasting transformation governed by the Spirit rather than the flesh.